Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to Writing IEP Objectives for Students with Severe Multiple Disabilities. Should you wish to ask a question during today's presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. I would now like to hand the floor to Terry Wendorf. Thank you. Ms. Wendorf, please go ahead.
Welcome everyone to Writing IEP Objectives for Students with Severe Multiple Disabilities. In this webinar today, we will take a look at some of the elements to include and avoid when writing objectives that are truly measurable for your students. Now, the focus and examples will apply mostly to students with severe multiple disabilities. However, I think that you will find some of the core concepts here are applicable to writing just good IEPs in general. Now, I'd like to start with a question to our group, and I'll just maybe comment on a couple of suggestions that are put forward from you. What are some of the challenges that you have experienced in writing measurable objectives for your students? So please feel free to use the chat box, and if you've got something, maybe just keep it brief. What are some of the challenges in writing measurable objectives for your students? I'm just waiting right now for one or two comments. Writing specific goals. I'm going to take a look at that today. Certainly writing measurable goals. Goals sound the same from year to year. That's a good one. That's a good challenge for sure. Making them meaningful. I like that comment. That's great. Okay, thank you very much. Lots of suggestions here. And I hope after today that you will have some additional tools in your tool bag to successfully address some of these areas. So thank you everyone for jotting down your comments. Okay, what I'd like to do before we start into our webinar today is I'd like to start first with a poll to determine what your role is in order to view the background of our group today. So please take a few seconds to check off your primary role at this point in time. It looks like we have a lot of teachers, 15 teachers, some speech and language pathologists. And I'll just give a few more seconds. Administration and a therapist, but mostly teachers and speech and language pathologists. And I don't see any more responses here, so I think we will move on. There we go. And since you've shared a little bit about your role, I thought I'd give a little bit of background. Just take a minute to share with you some of my roles as an educator and some of the activities I am currently involved with. I have been a teacher for many years and was very fortunate to work with a team of therapists as an outreach consultant throughout the province of British Columbia here in Canada. And I was also very fortunate to be able to serve as a program coordinator working with a Ministry of Education group to serve students with severe multiple disabilities. Over the last several years, I had worked with a colleague and we've designed an online course through a local university, Vancouver Island University, and I continue to be an online instructor for that course. If you're wanting any more information about that course or being able to access it, please feel free to contact myself or Vancouver Island University. It's called Developing Functional Curriculum. I really enjoy currently being a volunteer and a board member with the Therapeutic Writing Association in our local community and do the odd presentation for our local college. So that's a little bit about my background, and we'll get into our webinar. First of all, we need to do some observation of our students. That's where we need to start. And brainstorming with those who know the student best. This may involve some long-term brainstorming, such as MAPS. Some of you might be familiar with that, McGill Action Planning System, or other tools that you may use in your own specific school. We need to start any planning process by looking at the needs of the student. What does the student need to be more of a participant in his or her life? What does the student need to be more independent? What does the student need to strengthen relationships? These are all questions I like to look at when we are doing this type of brainstorming. For students with severe multiple disabilities, key areas such as cognitive, communication, social, and participation often emerge. Now, in a planning session, parents or school team members may also identify specifics for the student, such as having a voice or being more mobile. These should be noted as well, as they can begin to define the nature of the specific objectives that the team will create under these global headings. Now, I find that some areas overlap, and in this case, it may be better to merge some areas, as the objectives may incorporate more than one area. A specific objective may support the student's growth in communication, social, and also behavior areas. I'm not sure if you have found this as well. Just to give you an example, James will spontaneously use his hand on his voice output device when he wants attention 5 times a day, 80% of the time. Now, this objective may address his social need to attract others over to interact with. It may support a behavioral need to decrease his current undesired behavior, which is to hit or scream to get attention. It may also support his communication need to use his augmentative communication device in more situations. This is why I feel that we sometimes need to cluster global areas. Now, similar examples exist for academic and cognitive areas, as well as participation through, for instance, fine motor and gross motor areas. So let's take a closer look at goals and objectives. Now, I have found that sometimes teams can become confused between long-range goal statements and specific measurable short-term objectives. I think someone mentioned that when we were looking at some of our challenges. We need to keep in mind that the long-range goal should determine the areas that we are looking at. For example, increasing participation in fine motor and gross motor areas, as well as the purpose. For example, to increase participation or perhaps independence in order to improve the quality of life. So that addresses our purpose. I feel that we should not be including specific tools or equipment or referring to a specific situation or environment. Think of the goal as being a long-range vision for the future, something that will hopefully take the student into adulthood and also speak beyond the school setting. Long-range goals need to be worded to be able to refer to learning and skills that apply to the home and community as well as the school setting. I feel quite strongly about that. Now, for example, Karen will increase her participation within meaningful activities to strengthen her independence. Now, objectives, on the other hand, need to be detailed and specific to an actual task that can be measured. The vision in this case is much shorter and, in fact, may be just the next few months or upcoming term in school. I like to ask myself, so what would this actually look like for the student? What will the student actually do? For example, Karen will use her cheek to access her switch within 10 seconds with no prompts 8 out of 10 times. We're getting a lot more specific here. Now, when we are writing up the objective, we need to make sure that we are not attaching it to one particular situation. For example, Megan will use her iPad within 10 seconds with no prompting to make a choice between 6 items during mealtime on 3 consecutive days. And I've seen objectives like that. Perhaps you have as well. Making choices on the iPad is the objective, and mealtime is just one situation or strategy, as I like to call it, for this skill. A variety of situations can be listed in the strategy section, included, in this case, mealtime. However, it is very important that we collect our periodic data for objectives within a variety of real and functional activities that have meaning for our students. Sometimes we see people taking data in an isolated setting with materials that may not be motivating for the student. This can impact the reliability of the data in a number of ways for the student. First of all, the student may not be responding well due to the lack of interest in the testing environment. Maybe some of you have seen that. The student may be highly motivated by peers, and this can increase the student's performance level dramatically, as we can see here. Also, some students may learn how to respond in an isolated testing environment where there are no distractors, but how realistic is this data to the student's performance in real life? So for a variety of reasons, I feel it is important for us to periodically take data within real situations that naturally occur within the student's day and week. This will provide the most reliable data. So here are some sample fragments of objectives that I've seen in the past. Some phrases clearly indicate that we'd like to see what the student do, and other phrases list activities that are clearly outside the realm of what the student can actually do. So I'm going to throw this out to our group and ask, which phrases are actually objectives for the student's team? So if you'd like to jot down a phrase or two that you feel is really, truly an objective for the student's team rather than for the student. So maybe we can get 1 or 2 people just to throw something out on the chat box that you think is more of a the student's team's objective as opposed to something that would really be for the student. Receive training for seizures, excellent. Yes, carry out daily exercise programs, excellent. Excellent. I tend to feel that phrases as those listed on the right side, objectives for the team, should be included in the strategy section of the IEP. That's my feeling. They indicate what the team needs to do to support the student's growth on actual skills. Thank you. Thank you for your input there. Okay, now let's take a look at the different parts of an actual objective. First, we need to start with the name of the student. Now, you might think this is ridiculous to even mention, but many people do not include the student's name. Why is this a problem? Well, I find that when we don't start with a student's name, it is easier to slip into team-related statements or objectives. By starting with the name of the student, it helps us to visualize what the student will actually be doing. So we start with who. Next, we ask the question, what? What will the student actually do? In this case, it may be making choices. But we need more detail about the choices, perhaps between 4 choices. Is this for objects, symbols, pictures, or words? And once we have filled in the specific details, we need to ask the question, how will the student do this? In some cases, it might be with gaze, with reach, or if using auditory scanning, the student might smile to indicate the choice. This information needs to be placed within the objective. I always like to ask myself, and I think this is really helpful, would someone who does not know the student be able to visualize what I am describing? If not, then I need more detail. Next, we need to determine what the learning stretch is for the student on this skill. This is where we turn to our baseline data collected prior to writing the objective. Perhaps the student can perform this choice-making task, but it takes 30 seconds, which is not realistic for peers to wait when communicating with a student. So perhaps this is a stretch. Lastly, we need to include how many times the student should demonstrate this skill in order for us to consider a level of mastery. I usually find that 80% accuracy is acceptable for many teams, and it allows for students with severe disabilities to have their off days. Now, let's take a look at some areas where we can run into problems with writing objectives. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes teams write objectives that are only specific to a particular task. The skill should be transferable to a variety of situations and tasks to support the student as a lifelong learner. Now, I find it helpful to think of a specific situation as one example amongst others that should be listed in the strategy section to help the teaching assistant generalize the skill to a variety of settings. So, in this situation, Bob will use either hand on his switch with the power link within 10 seconds, 80% of the time. We do not include additional phrases such as during recess or during the bowling activity, as these are too specific and are only a couple of hopefully many other opportunities to practice this switch skill at school and also at home and in his community. Now, sometimes we may create objectives that are they just don't have enough detail to describe what we are actually measuring. An objective such as James will participate in his exercise program really doesn't give us any detail as to what his job is, what the stretch for him is, and how we might measure an element of progress within his exercise program. In some cases, this may involve the student allowing or tolerating 10 repetitions of range of motion if he can only deal with, say, 5 or 6 at the moment. Or perhaps the student is asked to help relax with a count of 3 to assist the assistant in moving his legs in an exercise program. This would then be the student's job in the activity. Another example is in the area of hand use. For example, Len will increase the use of his hands. Now, here we need to consult with our occupational therapist or physiotherapist to determine exactly which hand movements are realistic for our student. It might be something like a sweep, sweeping motion, hold, release, push. There are many hand movements, but unless we know specifically what is expected, how can we measure progress? And the same holds true for other areas such as vision. For example, if we write an objective such as Owen will increase the functional use of his vision, now what does this actually look like for the student? What might he actually do where we can measure progress? Perhaps he needs to use his vision with his hands for a longer period of time. Sometimes students look away when they use their hands, and perhaps you have some students who do this as well. This is an important functional vision skill, and perhaps Owen needs to learn to use his vision to help orientate around the school, looking to the right or left to indicate which way to go in the gym. This is also a functional use of vision that can then be measured. So when writing measurable objectives, we need to include enough detail about the actual skill so that we can measure it. Now, the stretch is a term that I picked up from a fellow teacher years ago, and I really like it. It refers to the area that indicates change or improvement for the student. First, we need to assess what the student is currently doing, and then ask ourselves, what would indicate improvement or illustrate more independence for the student in this specific skill? This may involve determining how many prompts your student currently requires within a certain time frame. This could also involve the length of time that it takes your student to perform a task. Perhaps we need to shorten this time to help the student become more efficient in the activity. I always like to ask myself and the teaching assistants and therapists I'm working with, what aspect would help the student become more independent in this task? This may involve being able to generalize a skill such as greetings to more people in the student's life. This is why we need to look at the current performance and ask, what is the stretch for this person? I'm just going to pause for a minute and again ask if anyone would like to share, just really briefly, think of a stretch that you'd like to share with the group. So something that's kind of a stretch for your student, a learning stretch. And that's, in other words, something that they're working towards. Any suggestions, anything that someone would like to share? No? Give a couple more seconds. Think about what your student's doing now, what you're working towards in a particular objective. Okay, we'll move on. Oops, here we go. Sue has something for us. Hitting their switch with more accuracy. Excellent. Good suggestion, Sue. Jane, using eye gaze to make choices. Excellent. Okay, lots of good suggestions here. Increasing the length of time that the student can maintain posture in the wheelchair, to work on the computer. Excellent. Some good suggestions there. Thanks for sharing those. Okay, so when we are asking ourselves, what is the stretch, we need to consider the many different areas where our students can demonstrate progress. We might ask ourselves if the behavior has increased or decreased. And in some situations, we may want to see an undesired or competing behavior, such as screaming or chewing on oneself. We might want to see that decrease. Perhaps we are looking for the student to participate in fewer false hits when using a switch. And I'll chat about this more later in our webinar. The ability to generalize a skill or behavior to new people, new situations, or new tools also demonstrates progress and a stretch in learning for our students. Now, duration of a behavior can also indicate progress. We will take a closer look at this as well in a few minutes. I feel that prompting is always an important area to include when measuring progress for our students. Increased independence can be demonstrated with less invasive prompts or fewer prompts needed to complete a task. Now, this is where we always need to get a baseline of prompts that are required to perform a task before we can really write our objective. Let's take a closer look now at how changing prompt levels can demonstrate progress for our students. Okay, these are just a few areas that we can include in our objectives to indicate progress. In the first picture here, we see a wrist prompt with a student learning switch use. The photo below demonstrates a hand-over-hand prompt provided for the student. The hand-over-hand prompt is often viewed as a more intrusive, although sometimes necessary prompt when first learning a new skill. The photo on the right illustrates a hand-under-hand prompt, which is sometimes seen as less visually intrusive prompt, but still provides a strong physical prompt for the student. Often, assistants may move to an elbow prompt and then hopefully to verbal or gestural prompts that do not require physical assistance. You can check with your local occupational therapist for a list of prompt levels that would be best for your student. We usually need to include wording to reduce prompts in our objectives in order to demonstrate progress and movement towards increased independence for our students. I mentioned earlier that students participating using fewer false hits can also indicate progress in this way. Now, false hits is where the student hits the switch before it is needed or appropriate. This can occur during a conversation using the step-by-step communicator or iPad if the student does not wait for the other person to respond before hitting the switch again. This can also occur when using a switch when running a piece of music for classmates in a gym warm-up activity using a power link and tape recorder or the AbleNet hook device to run an iPod. Hitting a switch when appropriate is sometimes indicative of the student's comprehension about the purpose of the switch, but it may also be tied into impulsive physical responses. The skill of learning to wait is an important one. We talked earlier about the duration of the skill being an area where we can measure progress within the objective. For example, perhaps the student has a very short attention span and the objective is to increase the length of time on task. However, if a student does not release his hand on a switch after hitting it, progress may involve the student decreasing the length of time his hand is on the switch after hitting it. Just wondering if anyone might wish to share an example where duration was a main part of the stretch to be measured for progress for their student. Again, feel free to use the chat box. Looking for an example where duration was a main part of the stretch that you were measuring for the progress of one of your students. Perhaps we'll move along to our next slide, and a couple suggestions might come in the meantime. Okay, so next, let's take a look at changes in incidence. Oh, here we go. Increase in time in the stander. Excellent. Decrease the length of off-task behavior during a 10-minute activity. Excellent. Two good examples. Okay, let's take a look now at changes in incidence. So sometimes the stretch for a student in the objective is to increase or decrease the frequency or incidence of a behavior. For example, perhaps we want our student to increase her time on a work-related task from 5 minutes to 10 minutes. In some situations, we may want our student to decrease the frequency of a behavior, such as repeatedly asking, "What time do I go home?" So again, I'm just going to give you a minute to see if there might be a situation that you might want to share with our group where there was an example that you can share where progress was focused on changing the frequency of the behavior. While people are maybe typing those in, I'll just move on to, oops, here we go, Teresa. Decreasing signing for all done. Oh, That's a good one, yeah. That's very similar to the obsession with what time do I go home? Thanks for sharing that example. Now, transferring skills to new people, situations, activities, and environments is a good indicator, I always think, of progress for many of our students. There are many ways in which our students can demonstrate this type of generalization. Often our students may learn to participate in a game with the teaching assistant, but can the student participate in the same turn-taking game with a classmate who does not prompt her? Students need to generalize skills to many people. A student may be very successful in using a switch to listen to his favorite music, but can he also demonstrate the same success when operating equipment in a cooking class? Students need to generalize skills to many situations and environments. A student may be able to hold a spoon for mealtime, but can that student also hold on to other tools such as a paintbrush, a sponge, or a cloth for wiping up the table? So students need to generalize skills to different tools. We particularly need to keep this in mind when preparing our students for transition to adulthood and the home and community environments. Okay, let's take a closer look at what our prompt levels might look like when writing an objective for our students. Usually, including a physical prompt is viewed as less independent. Sometimes we may need multiple levels of prompts when first learning a new skill, such as both physical and verbal. Eventually, you may be able to move towards just a visual prompt, such as a picture or a script located on a wall in the washroom. If our student no longer requires prompts of any sort, then we still need to indicate wording that illustrates that the student will perform the task independently. When including phrases about prompt levels, it is also important to include a time frame. Otherwise, we could be waiting for a long time after the prompt. One example, the student will use the assistant's hand to point to the desired picture within 15 seconds with only one verbal prompt 80% of the time. Now, sometimes students use a prop such as someone else's hand to touch a picture or object. I always like to picture the teaching assistant measuring a skill, and this helps me to include all aspects that I will need to really measure that skill. I like to ask the question, so if the student performs this task once, then are we to assume he has mastered the skill? Well, of course, the answer is no. So how often would we need to see the student perform the task in order for us to assume the level of mastery for this skill? There are lots of ways that we can write this up that will help us to collect data that will indicate a level of competence. For most objectives, I tend to aim for 80% accuracy level, as many of our students may never perform with 100% accuracy due to variations in physical and cognitive abilities on a day-to-day basis. How you phrase this? Well, will determine how the teaching assistant will collect the data. For example, 4 to 5 times over 3 consecutive days indicates that the assistant will collect data for a specific task over those 3 days. Spontaneously 3 times throughout the day, 80% of the time, means that the assistant needs to be ready to put a check mark down at any time the behavior is observed occurring spontaneously throughout the day. After a month of periodic data collection, the team can determine if this is occurring 80% of the time. Independently on 5 consecutive days would give us a pretty good indication that the student had mastered the skill if it occurs on 5 consecutive days. If one day it does not occur, then the data collection may move on to another time later in the month or next month. I usually suggest that data collection occur periodically for different objectives throughout the month so that the teaching assistant does not feel overwhelmed with data collection. Here's a sample monthly data collection sheet that covers all of the students' objectives. As you can see here, data collection occurs periodically over the month, and some days it is nice to schedule no data collection to give the teaching assistant and the student a break. I encourage assistants to always take data within naturally occurring functional activities, as I mentioned earlier, so that there are no testing situations. If you are interested, we can take a closer look at various ways of taking data, perhaps in a future webinar. In the meantime, this sample illustrates that data collection needs to be consistent, but also sporadic. Now, sometimes teams get so carried away with including percentages and numbers that not only is it impossible to actually measure the objective, it doesn't really even make any sense. Maybe you've come across a few of those in your work. Here's an example of what I'm referring to. The skill is about the student getting herself into a ready position so that she can work or communicate. So, Ursula will show that she is ready 2 to 3 times on 4 to 5 days with 60% accuracy. Now, first of all, there are a whole lot of numbers here which are a bit challenging to figure out how and when to collect data. Also, there is no information provided in this objective as to how Ursula will demonstrate that she is ready. There is also no reference to whether the student will be prompted, and if so, how many prompts might be needed and what kind of prompts. Lastly, we see here that this objective is set for only 60% accuracy for success. In my opinion, this tells us that the goal is too high or difficult for the student. Instead, we may need to add a verbal prompt in order to increase the likelihood that Ursula can reach her goal 80% of the time. By adding some of these details to our objective, it is much clearer for her assistant to see what will be measured. For example, Ursula will show that she is ready with both hands on the table, her head up in midline, and looking at her assistant 5 times a day with only 1 verbal prompt 80% of the time. If you picture yourself or the assistant actually collecting the data, I find this really helps to write a clear objective. When working with teams, I have often come across the word observation in the assessment. Also the area is called sometimes method of evaluation or evaluation of progress section in the IEP. And upon inquiry, I often find that some teachers come to the assistant before reporting time and ask how the student's doing on the skill. However, this type of reporting is extremely subjective. Our reporting needs to be objective, and this can only occur through data collection. Now, video has its own purpose as well, but the information in the video needs to transfer into some concrete data. There are lots of different ways to collect data for objectives, some quite informal and others more formally. In some cases, your student's therapist may design a data collection sheet that is specific to that behavior. In other cases, grades on assignments or tests may be collected and used as data. In some situations, it may work best to have a timed practice, although it is always best, in my opinion, to take data within naturally occurring functional activities throughout the day. I personally prefer to collect all of the objectives and create a monthly checklist, as I find it easier for the assistant to refer to as part of a daily or weekly plan. Anyways, everyone has their own preference. And here are just a few of the many ways that we can collect data in a concrete, objective way. The important thing is to be objective not subjective in our methods of evaluation. So in closing, let's just recap the key components of a well-written and measurable IEP objective. Always remember to start with a person's name to help keep you on track with a student-focused objective. Who is doing this? Denise. What will she do? Make choices. Add more detail. 1 choice, 2 choices, 3 choices, pictures, objects, symbols. Between 2 objects. How is she going to make these choices? With her reach, her vocalization, her word approximation, pointing, with her gaze? Now, after doing our baseline data assessment, we determine what the stretch is for our student in this particular objective. In this case, perhaps it involves time and prompts, within 10 seconds with no prompts. Now we need our measurement for success, 80% of the time. Now we ask, will this demonstrate mastery on just 1 day? Perhaps we set the criteria for 80% over 4 consecutive days. Now we have a clear objective that we can observe and measure on a data collection form. Remember that the where question for this formula should be located in your strategy section, as hopefully your student will be practicing this skill within many different activities and locations. I hope today that you come away with a clearer understanding of how you can truly create measurable objectives for your students with severe multiple disabilities. Objectives need to be measurable, functional, and have real data. They need to make sense when we read them. We need to ask ourselves, can I actually visualize the assistant taking this data? This will help us write objectives that are clear, therefore easy to collect data, and report progress in an objective way. I think we're coming close to the end of our time here, and I just wanted to give many thanks to Kristen today for her assistance in arranging this webinar. I also want to thank AbleNet for providing this wonderful service to their clients. I wish you well, all of our group today, as we embark on IEP writing at the beginning of the school year. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me as indicated here. And also, please do forward additional suggestions to Kristen for more topics related to students with severe multiple disabilities. And I also just wanted to thank our group. Thank you so much today for your participation. I really appreciate it. And I wish you all the best at the beginning of the school year.